In this video, I wanted us to take a look at Forza Motorsport and check out the impact of ray tracing in the game. Firstly, I wanted to take a look at the visual impact that ray tracing adds to the game by comparing a few different scenarios. And then I wanted to focus the second half of the video more on the performance aspect. For this, I'm going to try to go as much into detail as I can. I'll be using all four of my GPUs, the RX 6800 XT, RX 7900 XTX, RTX 3080 Ti, and RTX 4090, because the answer might depend on the hardware you have and your personal preferences. So strap in and let's dive into the visual differences first, and then we'll move on to the next part. So in Forza Motorsport, we have ray trace reflections and ambient occlusion, and this allows the car's own body parts to reflect on themselves, adding to the realism. And then you also have ambient occlusion, which further adds to the realism as well, applying proper shadows into areas that are not directly hit by the light. So for example, this is with ray tracing turned off. And you can see the inside of the wheels they look brighter than they perhaps should be. So let's turn ray tracing on. You can see the license plate holder now is reflecting the grass and the pavement, and you can also see the carbon fiber splitter on the front is reflecting onto the bumper and vice versa. Now you can see inside the wheels, they look more realistic because light would not be able to penetrate directly onto them. But you can also see additional reflections on the paint, the surrounding area. Even the lighting is a little bit different. Like if we look at them side by side or on top of one another with ray tracing off on the top, you can even see that even the car's own color looks a little bit different with ray trace reflections turned on, because there's additional ambient assets being reflected. So yeah, I mean, it definitely looks nicer with ray tracing turned on. It looks more realistic. That's not to say that it doesn't look good without it. Of course it does. But obviously with ray tracing on, it looks more realistic. Another good example of ray tracing and how it affects the environment and the reflections is this shot here. With ray tracing turned off, it looks very nice, right? But if you turn ray tracing on, now we have additional environment being reflected to the point where even the color is changed. And then also look at the wheels. With ray tracing off, they're more unrealistic looking, whereas now we have that ambient occlusion filling in shadows as making it look more realistic. I mean, even look at the front grille, for example. With ambient occlusion turned on, it looks dark like it would be, because light would not be able to get in there at the angle the sun is at, directly above, right? And then also the license plate holder is also reflecting the pavement. Even the car's own shadow on the bottom with ray tracing on looks more realistic. It's softer. It looks more realistic because, like I said, our eyes would recognize these things because we see how light interacts with everyday objects on a daily basis. So these things sort of add to the overall immersion, I feel. Speaking of the front of the car, we can see the bumper reflecting onto the carbon fiber splitter. You can also see a good example of the ambient occlusion and how it applies shadows onto underneath the car, but also the middle of the splitter. And with it off, you can see the shadows are more defined, not really as soft. It doesn't really look as realistic. What's kind of interesting too, though, is that with ray tracing on the bottom, we can see the radiator. Whereas with ray tracing off, it's not really noticeable. So that's kind of strange, but kind of cool at the same time. So I wanted to examine the rear light with ray tracing off. And so we can see how transformative it is once we turn it on. Not only does it add more realistic reflection, but you can even see the light itself reflect onto the paint and even the stoplight itself has more color, right? It looks more realistic, even though with ray tracing off, it doesn't look bad, but this looks much better. Definitely much better. Another pretty cool thing about ray trace reflections is that opponent cars are actually reflected on your car as well. Could be the rims, pretty much everything, right? You can see the opponent car's reflections on your own car, and I mean, any surface that is reflective, you'll be able to see this. So it actually makes for some pretty cool photo mode pictures, I suppose. I personally like photo mode with games. I try to take a lot of pictures because I do enjoy it. And I think ray tracing in Forza Motorsport is perfect for that. With ray tracing off on the left, we can clearly see that that car's reflection is now missing. So yeah, I would say that for photo mode, I don't see why you wouldn't turn it on. But for racing though, I think we need to look at that a little bit more. On an unrelated side note, I felt I had to mention this, but if you look at the decals on this opponent car, they're very low res. And I get it, you might not directly see it, but it just does stand out. And especially if you just look at this chopper that's actually kind of far in the distance, and its decals are a lot more high res than the opponent car. So I don't know, that I found that kind of distracting, and I hope that it's just a bug, but I don't think anything will happen. So clearly there's a noticeable difference in photo mode between ray tracing on and off, but what about when you're actually racing? So we have ray tracing off on the left and then ray tracing maxed out on the right. And to be honest, I can't really see a difference. I do believe that the ray tracing in this game, the reflections, there is a range at what is reflected, but in this particular track, I don't think there's really much, or maybe the camera angle doesn't really benefit it. So I would say in this case, I can't really notice a difference. But let's take a look at another test I did with a different car in a different track and see if there's a noticeable difference. Here, with ray tracing on the right, there's definitely a noticeable difference. With reflections are a lot more realistic. You can see the beige tiles properly reflect on the car and on the rims. You can see that glow affecting the coloring. And you can also see the white and red squares, once we reach them, are a lot more accurately reflected on the ray tracing side on the right, whereas on the left they're not even really visible. So that is noticeable, but how noticeable would it be if you were actually driving the car though? I don't know. In this scene, I wanted to see the effect of ambient occlusion. So here we have ray tracing on, and I wanted to see if you are an interior driving person. I usually like to drive like this. Would there be much of a difference with ray trace ambient occlusion enabled? Well, here we're turning it off, and you can see that the speedometer cluster is a bit darker. So I'm assuming that with RTAO, it's lighter because that's how the lighting affects it. I'm not really sure, but it doesn't look that much different. We still have ray tracing disabled, and let's try enabling ray tracing and see if it changes anything. And bam, ray tracing is on. You can see the door panels become a little bit different in how the shadow appears, and also the cluster is a little bit lighter. So it does make a bit of a difference. I'll cycle through it for you guys. Well, here's a bit of interior driving for you guys, and I try to get them to match. We have ray tracing on the right and ray tracing off on the left. I personally can't really tell the difference, and if it is, I wouldn't be able to tell if it was on or off if it wasn't side by side. So I don't really see much of a benefit while you're actually driving as far as the car goes. However, For me, the most noticeable part about having ray tracing on while driving is actually with some of the buildings and stuff like that. That is way more noticeable than the actual car, at least from my experience. So let's take a quick look at that and then we'll jump onto the performance. You'll find buildings with glass usually at the finish line that actually do a pretty good job of reflecting. Like here, we can see the trees from across the road reflecting onto the glass. And with ray tracing off, they're actually completely missing. So ray trace reflections does really add quite a bit to some of these buildings. When you drive by, you can see them. But sometimes some of the trees will pop in and out as well. So I don't know if that's like a bug, but clearly you can see as we move here, the trees are being reflected on the glass podium. You can also see the tree reflections on the second floor windows as well. But there's other tracks that are an even better example. If we turn ray tracing off, as you can see here, the trees are completely missing, and so is a lot of detail. I mean, there is some things being reflected a bit, but not really. It definitely is better with ray trace reflections on. Is this very noticeable while you're driving? Not really, I guess. In some tracks, it's a lot more noticeable than others. Like this building here, for example, you can see some really nice reflections on the windows. And it's that type of a dark tinted window that would reflect accurately like this. And it's mostly static objects that are being reflected, but it does look nice. And it is something that your eye does catch while you're driving, of course, because these buildings are all over the place and some of them are huge as you go around. Especially on replay, you notice it a lot more, but you do notice it while driving. And yeah, I would say these type of reflections stand out to me more than the actual car itself. For example, if we turn ray tracing off, you can see that we can see a bit of the sky being reflected on the side, but other than that, the reflections are completely missing. Now, it doesn't look bad, but it doesn't look as realistic. This is an up close with ray tracing completely off. So you can kind of see the transparency and inside the building a little bit. And then when you turn ray tracing on, you can still see inside a little bit, but you also see the ambulance and the grass, the road, and across the street as well. So yeah, I would say this looks quite nice. However, my favorite track is Hakone in Japan. Let's take a look at that. This is Hakone at night, and if you look at the roof, that's all ray trace reflections. Without it, there's not really much reflecting there at all. Especially if you pay close attention to the screen on the left, that reflection wouldn't be there without the ray tracing. However, I've noticed that dynamic reflections in this game, like that screen for example, tend to be a little bit noisy, very noisy. So I'm not sure what type of denoiser they're using, but in a track like this, having ray tracing enabled does stand out quite a lot. As you can see the screen again, it's being reflected, and then also the roof in the middle, that's also reflecting the podium down below it, and so is the glass reflecting the area around it, which without ray tracing, that would be pretty much almost non-existent. As a matter of fact, let's take a look at it without ray tracing on. With RT off now, the reflections on the roof are pretty much all gone. We can just see the lighting. There is some basic reflections on the glass, but they're not very accurate at all. And then if you look at the screen on the left, there's no reflection on the roof at all. And neither is there on the big main roof in the middle. So in scenarios like this, ray tracing does add some to the atmosphere, I would say for sure. Same thing if we try to go backwards, you're going to see a lot of those reflections missing. But as far as ambient occlusion, it's pretty much non-existent at night. As a matter of fact, I made a video doing a side-by-side in this particular race at night, and pretty much 95% of the people in the comment section said that they couldn't tell a difference and that they'd rather have the higher frame rate, and I can't blame them. Well, time has come for us to look at the performance, because that'll depend on whether you want to turn ray tracing on or off. And we're going to begin from my 6800 XT all the way to the 4090, and we're going to do a side-by-side of ray tracing on full reflections and ray tracing off completely. 6800 XT and 3080 Ti will be focusing on 1440p, with 7900 XTX and 4090 focusing on 4K. And the results of this will be based on one lap around this racetrack, okay? So we're going to begin here with the 6800 XT, and I'll be using my AM5 7800 X3D system for all of these tests, okay? So let's take a look at the 6800 XT, and we'll move down to the next GPUs. Well, as you can see, the cost to turn ray tracing on is massive. I mean, we end up losing almost 50% of our performance by going from full ray tracing with ambient occlusion to off. It's still respectable performance, even at 1440p with ray tracing fully on the 6800 XT. It's still pretty good, but I can't necessarily blame anybody for thinking ray tracing may not be worth it. As a matter of fact, that's kind of what I've been hearing from people, is that they don't really think that or feel that it's worth it in the game, because it does look gorgeous when you're in photo mode, obviously, but while racing, as you can see here, is not that big of a difference. However, there is a big difference in the performance. So we'll skip to the end of the lap here and take a look at our average frame rate, and you'll notice that it's around 45% of the performance that we lose by enabling ray tracing. And with that out of the way, we're going to jump on the 3080 Ti next, which will also be at 1440p, same exact settings, ray tracing on the right, ray tracing off on the left. Onto the 3080 Ti then. We're running this at 1440p as well, just like the 6800 XT, and interestingly enough, both GPUs are actually pretty close with rasterization only. It's not until you enable ray tracing that the 3080 Ti pulls ahead quite a bit. The cost to the performance, if we look at the averages at the end of the lap, is 33% for the 3080 Ti, and it was 48% for the 6800 XT. 6800 XT though does pretty well here with rasterization only, and it's a very efficient card as well, which is something I love about it. But it'll also do 1440p 60 native ray tracing all day long. Onto the 7900 XTX then, and for this one and the 4090 we're testing at 4K, and we seem to be getting pretty good performance here with ray tracing, and especially with ray tracing off. The cost to our performance seems to be around 36%. So yeah, I think you're fine. I mean, all the GPUs that we've tested so far with the targeted resolution, you can do ray tracing, no problem. If you wanted to, you will be above 60. But being a racing game, and as I believe I've done a pretty decent job of showing you the impact of ray tracing visually and performance-wise, I think that kind of speaks for itself, and you guys can make your own decision. But I did want to take a look at this. So yeah, I think the 7900 XTX does a pretty good job here. Although if it was me, I probably would turn ray tracing off unless I was taking photos or trying to record a replay or something like that. So yeah, 36% cost to turn ray tracing on to our performance. Let's move on to the last GPU then, the RTX 4090. Onto my last GPU then, the RTX 4090 at 4K. On the right with ray tracing on, we seem to be pretty close to my refresh rate, 120 on my LG OLED TV. And the cost of performance, as of right now, if we look at the averages, is 33% to turn ray tracing on. However, with the 4090, the 7800 X3D seems to actually be unable to keep the 4090 fully GPU bound at all times. As you can see, it's dropping well below 99%, and the power consumption is dropping to the 200s without ray tracing on. So the 4090 would be capable of even more frame rate if I had an even faster CPU. Unfortunately, this isn't really a shock to me because this game is actually very CPU demanding with or without ray tracing actually. So it's actually one of the reasons why I wanted to use the 7800X3D for all GPUs I tested, because I wanted to use the fastest CPU I got, so that's why I did it. But yeah, I just want to give up my opinion on this, and there's a reason why I wanted to make this video as well, is that personally for me, I don't think turning ray tracing on is worth it. Even though I have plenty of performance to turn it on, I just don't really think it's worth it, primarily because I don't think there is much of a visual difference 95% of the time. Sure, there are some tracks where it is a lot more noticeable, like Hakone in Japan, but personally, I don't think it's really worth it. Now, the developers have promised us ray trace global illumination, which I feel that'll make a lot more of a noticeable difference. So I don't know when that's coming, but they've told us that it is coming at some point. So when that comes out, I will make sure to test it out. But for now, that is my opinion. I personally don't really turn ray tracing on unless it's for photos, then it looks amazing. But while driving, as I believe I've shown you, I don't think there's much of a difference. So you guys do whatever you want though. But anyway, I hope you guys like this. Give it a like if you like it. It took me a while to make this. I enjoyed making it. But if you want to subscribe for more content like this, feel free to do so. I would highly appreciate it. And I appreciate you guys watching my videos regardless. So thank you for that. And I hope you all have a great rest of the day. Bye bye.